The 2022 F1 season may not have been the best, but at least there were a few good races. So I thought, why not rank them on a tier list? Okay, so first up is Bahrain, and I am going to throw Bahrain in great race. This was the race that gave us the first glimpse into what the new regulations were going to be like. And the moment I point to in particular was those 3 laps where Charles and Max were going back and forth. So Max would make a dive down the inside on turn 1 and take the lead, but then Charles, being the smart little devil that he is, would catch him back on the next DRS zone. And it just set up what we all thought at the time was going to be a great battle for the championship. Unfortunately, Ferrari had other plans, but that was such a good little 3-lap battle. The other big moments from this race, Pierre's engine catching on fire, and then of course both Red Bulls going out in the last 3 laps of the race, which I took great delight out of. But between those moments, there wasn't really much racing happening for the lead or for any other teams. McLaren was also awful at this race. But yeah, I just think it was a great race. Next up, we have Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia would have probably gone in great race if it wasn't for the fact that a missile landed within a couple kilometers of the circuit. And the FIA decided to still go ahead with the race anyways. And you had the drivers having a 4-hour meeting the night before quali. No one knows what they're discussing, and I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that. But they still went racing. So it's going into erratic for the wrong reasons for that reason. And I think just the fact that F1 is even racing in Saudi, similar to how the World Cup is happening in Qatar, I just don't think it should have happened. But they just love that money. But in terms of the racing, you had the Alpines going at each other for a great chunk of the race. You also had, towards the end, kind of a similar thing to the Bahrain race where you had Charles leading and Max trying to pass him going onto the main straight, and so they were playing DRS chicken around the last corner, which was highly entertaining. I remember there being quite a few VSCs in this one just because of like carbon fiber on the track, and so that kind of impacted things a little bit. But yeah, it definitely wasn't as dramatic as Saudi Arabia in 2021, but yeah, I think the stuff that was happening kind of around this race definitely overshadowed it a little bit, at least for me. Next up is Australia, and Australia is kind of in between good moments and don't bother for me. I think I'm going to throw it in some good moments. This was a race that Charles pretty well dominated from start to finish. He got his Grand Slam, so there wasn't really any race for the lead. Max's car broke down again about 2/3 of the way through the race, and so that didn't help either and really made it look like Ferrari was going to run away with the championship. But you did have in this race Alex Albon doing his mega stint, only stopping with 1 lap left to go off of his hard tires, which was really impressive to see. So that's kind of the one moment that I remember from this race. I think there was a lot of good battles in the midfield, but yeah, there wasn't much happening up front for this one. Oh, and you had Carlos crashing on the second lap as well into the gravel, which was kind of a sign of things to come for him. Him and his relationship with gravel this year was a bit much. The 4th race of the year was Imola, and Imola was very similar to Australia, except for this one, Max got the Grand Slam, and so I'm going to also throw it in some good moments, but a little bit ahead of Australia. This one you had Daniel taking out Carlos on the first lap, and once again, Carlos getting stuck in the gravel. You had the Mercs just being stuck in or at least Lewis, being stuck in a DRS train for the entire race, and he didn't manage to get it to the points. You had that infamous moment of Charles spinning out and having to go in and change his front wing. And then you had the only shock podium of the entire season with Lando Norris managing to get third place here. Somehow. I don't understand how that happened after how bad they were in Bahrain. That's basically what happened in that one. A lot of DRS trains because it was raining and they didn't turn it on forever. It was very irritating. Next up, we have Miami. This one, like, kind of could go into dramatic for the wrong reasons just because the entire, like, hoopla around this race was just so unhinged. And the podium was unhinged. The cooldown room was unhinged. Getting their way to the podium was unhinged. It was just chaotic. But the racing itself was absolutely atrocious. And if I remember correctly, there was actually like quite a few overtakes that happened in this race, but for some reason the race directors decided to show like none of it. But yeah, there wasn't really a race for the lead at all in this one. Max got Carlos in the first corner and then managed to get Charles by like lap 10. And then he just kind of ran off and Charles was never able to catch him. You had Checo like trying to get at Carlos but couldn't. You had the whole moment with Pierre and Lando colliding. You had Seb and Mick colliding, which was so sad. Oh, Mick was on for his first points, and then he just crashed into Seb and took them both out, and it was so sad. But yeah, so that was just a really boring race on a really boring track. Next up is Spain. Spain was Spain. That last chicane just really kills any opportunity at passing. And there wasn't any racing for the lead because initially you had Charles way out in front, and then you had Carlos and Max both getting blown into the gravel. And then you had Max and George had an excellent little battle there. But at the time, it wasn't for the lead until Charles's engine blew, and then it was for the lead. But then George just gave up and went in the pits. So it was like anytime there was an opportunity for a battle, it kind of just dissipated. Max, of course, had a lot of DRS issues this race, and that whole radio message was like, I pressed it like 50 times that last lap. And then, of course, Checo saying, when he was told to let Max pass, that this is really unfair, but okay. So yeah, there was like some good moments in this race for sure, but once Charles was out, Max just basically ran away with it. So yeah, a bit of a bummer. Oh no, you cannot see it. All right, quick background color change. The Monaco is usually a bit of a bore, but this year it was spiced up by the fact that it was raining and the fact that Ferrari made a few horrendous calls on strategy, which is why I'm putting it in some good moments. I wouldn't necessarily call them good moments, but they were certainly moments. You had Carlos making the call to go directly from the full wets to the slicks, which turned out to probably have been the right call if he hadn't have gotten stuck behind a Williams on his entire outlap. And so he came out behind Checo, but the mistakes that they made were with Charles because they pit him a couple laps too late onto the inters and then got him stuck behind Carlos in a double stack that they shouldn't have done. So Checo managed to get both of them by overcutting them on the inter tires, which was a brilliant call by Hannah Schmitz. And this was the start of the unraveling of Ferrari. You could argue that that started in Spain with their engine problems, or in Imola with Charles's spin out, but this was just the start of them just making horrendous strategy call after horrendous strategy call. And just the look on Charles's face after and listening to all of those radio messages is just the pain that you feel for this poor man. So it had some moments. Next up is Baku, and Baku was so disappointing. It's usually one of my favorite races of the year, but this year just nothing happened. Of course, I think the big reason why is because both of the Ferraris DNF'd in this race. Carlos did within like 7 laps, so he was irrelevant. But Charles's engine blowing, kind of right around when the strategy was getting interesting, just kind of took all the steam out of this race. And after that, you just had Max completely running away with it and Checo having to let him by again with no fighting. And this was kind of the point in the season where people thought, oh, Checo has a chance at winning the World Championship. But then I think this race, he just did not have the pace. This one was just a real disappointment for me, and I have it in don't bother. I think the only other things that happened in this one were a little bit of squabbling on McLaren's team radio about team orders and Daniel wanting to be let through when he was on the superior strategy, and then Lando being pissed that he wasn't let through at the end. So, yeah. Next up is my home race of Canada. And Canada for me is going in great race. Charles had to take an engine penalty for this race, so he was coming through from the back. Of course, you had Alonso having his P2 start, so that was kind of interesting. Max led for most of it, but there were moments where it looked like Carlos might get him with his tire strategy, and he was ahead, and then there was a couple safety cars, brought everything close together. You had a few Max and Hamilton battles, those last few laps after that safety car, where you had Carlos kind of right on Max's tail trying to pass him, but Max just never made a mistake. Next up, we have Silverstone, and this one is obviously going right into straight banger. This race had everything. You had a very scary first lap crash with Joe flipping over and then going into the barrier. You then had Max taking the lead off of Charles, it was Carlos. Carlos had pole, and so Carlos sped off, and then Max got Carlos because Carlos was like freaking out and made a couple mistakes in the lead. You had Max taking over, then you had the two Alpha Tauris spinning out, and the damage from that falling on the track, Max ran over it and damaged his car. So then you had the Ferraris coming through, you had the team orders going on with them. At one point you had Hamilton leading after both the Ferraris pitted, and it looked like Hamilton had a chance to win the race. And then you had the Esteban Ocon caused safety car. And the last 12 laps of this race, or whatever it was the best racing of the entire year. You had Charles once again getting screwed over and not pitting for softs, and you had the stop inventing comment from Carlos when Ferrari were asking him to try and give Charles some space. And then you had just those battles. So Carlos came through and got Charles right on the restart, and he sped off. And then you had Charles, Checo, and Lewis just all constantly battling. You had through goes Hamilton. You had Charles making what I think was the best overtake of the year, going around the outside at Cops. And you had Alonso and Norris looking like they were going to join the fight for a little bit. And so, it was just so exciting. It was, just invigorating to watch. And Carlos winning his first ever race. And just an unbelievable race. Austria. And I have Austria in great race as well. This was one of the rare occasions where Ferrari did a better job than Red Bull in setting up their car. Red Bull seemed to have trouble with that on sprint race weekends. And so Ferrari just had the pace, and so Charles passed Max 3 times over the course of the race to take the victory. And then you had it looking like it was going to be a Ferrari 1-2 until Carlos's engine just completely blew up. So that happened. You had a moment where you had 5 cars going into one corner at the same time, and Mick got points at this race. And then at the end, you had Charles having issues with his throttle pedal, and it looked like Max might have been able to catch up to him, so you kind of had like the suspense and intrigue from that as well. So definitely a great race, and didn't fully know what was going to happen in it. Next up is France. This one definitely had an iconic moment, and I think kind of was the moment that defined the entire Drivers' Championship, and that was Charles spinning out from the lead. But once again, that moment took all the air out of the race as Max just ran away with it after that. So it's going in some good moments. Yeah, other than that, I think you had Yuki spinning out on the first lap because of Esteban. You had George and Checo having a good battle. You had Carlos and Checo having a good battle, and Ferrari inexplicably calling him into the pits while he was in the middle of the battle. Not now, not now. Ugh. So many times. So I think that race will forever be remembered for the Charles crash. But I think other than that, there wasn't too much racing happening. And Paul Ricard is just a terrible track. I hate it so much. So I'm very glad that it's gone from the calendar. Next up is Hungary. And Hungary is also going into great race. It was very cold at Hungary, and so Mercedes and Red Bull, realizing that it was cold and realizing that that meant that the hard tires were going to be terrible, and so neither of them went onto the hard tires. But you had Ferrari, you had McLaren, and you had Alpine making the terrible decision to go onto the hard tires, and Ferrari's was literally the worst because they had all this data from Alpine looking terrible on the hard tires, and like everyone and their mother could see that going onto the hard tires was gonna be a bad time, and yet they pitted Charles anyways for the hard tires. Ugh. And this one, of course, you had Max starting from 10th and Checo starting from 11th because of issues in qualifying, and Max still managed to win this race because once again, Hannah Smith was a genius. You also had George starting on pole in this one, so he was leading for quite a bit of it. Hamilton had quite a bit of pace. You had Max doing the spin out when he was in the lead and letting Charles back past. Yeah, all in all, 3 teams going at it, and you didn't quite know who was going to win until probably about 10 laps to go, and then it looked pretty clear that Max kind of had it in the bag. But yeah, that was definitely another Ferrari disaster. But it made for a great race. Next up is Spa. And Spa for me is another one that had some good moments. So I'm throwing it in just after France. I think it was another Max domination, but at least he had to overtake a bunch of cars to dominate. And of course you had that moment at the start where Hamilton crashed into Alonso. You had Latifi taking out Bottas. You had Esteban Ocon making a couple double overtakes, which was great. But yeah, Max was just in a rocket ship. He started from 14th, and by the end of like lap 5, I think he was in 6th or something, and then by the end of lap 12 he was leading. It was just unbelievable. There was just no competition. He was too powerful. And then you, of course, the moment when Charles was told to pit to go for the fastest lap, came out behind Alonso and like had to repass him, didn't even get the fastest lap, and then got nailed with a speeding in the pit lane penalty. So he ended up losing the position to Alonso anyways, when he could have just kept going and like held on to that 5th position or whatever. Instead, Ferrari just to overcomplicate things and shot themselves in the foot. Just every single race had something. Poor Charles. Next up is Zandvoort, and this is another one that surprisingly was a pretty great race. It was another one where you had 3 teams kind of in it. At moments, Max was leading, but then there was a couple safety cars that happened, and Mercedes went on an aggressive strategy. I think they were going for the one stop until the second safety car came out. And you had the whole thing with Yuki and his seatbelt. Oh, Carlos had a brutal race in this one with the long pit stop because they couldn't find his 3rd tire. Oh, jeez. Yeah, but just like another one where there were 3 teams going for the lead, but unfortunately after that second safety car, they didn't pit Lewis for new tires, and so he ended up getting Ferrari'd in that race and coming 4th. Charles managed to get back on the podium for the first time in forever, and yeah, so that was a great race as well. And Monza is another race that is one of my favorites, and yet this year it was such a disappointment. After the last 3 years of having Charles winning in 2019, Pierre winning in 2020, and Daniel winning in 2021, I was like, oh, it's going to be such a great race. And no. Yeah, I think Charles started on pole, and you had a super jumbled up grid because everyone took engine penalties for this one. I think Max started in 7th, but it was pretty inevitable that he was going to win. And he did. Other than that, you had Daniel having a decent race and managing to hang on into a points position, keeping Pierre behind by never making a mistake. You had Nick de Vries subbing in for Alex Albon and managing to get points in his debut. But yeah, Monza's just one of those tracks where like DRS just doesn't help, and so no one ever passes each other. Of course, you had Daniel being hit by the Monza curse and his engine dying with like 8 laps to go or something, and then the race ended under safety car. Just the worst ending. So it's going and don't bother behind Miami, because Miami at least had some overtaking and some moments and collisions and stuff like that, but yeah, Monza just like nothing happened. So disappointing. Next up is Singapore, and Singapore for me was actually a great race. I'm kind of breaking my rule in which there has to be a race for the lead, because Checo pretty well led this one from start to finish. You did have a little bit close to the end where it looked like Charles might have been able to catch up to him, or at least keep within that penalty range. But this race is so difficult to place because for a lot of it, it was really boring and there was nothing happening. And then you had everyone crashing, and it was so chaotic. You had no idea what was going to happen next, because you had Lewis like going straight into the wall. You had both Alpine's engines breaking down at some point. You had Latifi taking out Joe and then him being out. You had Albon going straight into the wall. You had Yuki carrying way too much speed into the corner on fresh tires and going right into the wall. And you're like, oh, Yuki, you gotta stop making these mistakes, man. But it was like a perfectly timed incident for McLaren to make a double pit stop. And so they had a great strategy in this one by staying on those inters forever. And and you had on the safety car restart, you had Max trying to pass Lando and just locking up and going into the runoff, and then having to pit again for new tires because he flat spotted them, and him having to come from the back. And so it was just chaos. Everyone in this race had a bad time except for McLaren. As much as it like wasn't super great for the whole time, and there wasn't really a race for the lead, I still have to put it a great race because it was just so chaotic. But it wasn't worthy enough for a banger. Next up is Suzuka, and Suzuka is also going into dramatic for the wrong reasons. This is mainly because of the decisions by the FIA. So you had the decision to start the race from the grid, in which it was way too wet for intermediates, but the wet tires are so terrible that everyone started on the inters anyways, and then you had people not having any visibility whatsoever, which is terrifying to watch the onboards of. So you had Seb spinning out on the first corner, and then you had Carlos aquaplaning. You had Albin's car just like dying. You had Joe spinning out. You had Pierre picking up the advertising board, having to go into the pits, and then coming back out and going way too quickly around. Well, he kept to his delta, but he was going quick around the circuit to catch up to the safety car, not knowing that there was a recovery vehicle on the track getting Carlos's vehicle. And it was a completely unacceptable decision by the FIA, who just do not understand what it is like for drivers in those conditions. And that was the conversation that dominated the entire 2-hour delay that happened. And then we had the race restart, and that being good, but then everyone was confused by how the points were going to be scored in this race, because everyone was talking the whole time about it being like based on the number of laps they were able to complete, and everyone was like, okay, they're only going to get half points because they only needed to get like half the race done. But it turns out, since they restarted and were able to finish the race, they got full points, which meant that Max won the championship, but everyone thought he didn't win the championship, and so there was confusion over whether he won the championship or not, and he didn't even know, and it was it was just so chaotic. And so everything that happened around this race was way more interesting and way more chaotic than the actual race itself. Although the race itself had some good moments. You had Esteban managing to hold off Hamilton, you had Seb and Latifi making a great call to go onto the inters before the race even restarted. And yeah, I think Latifi got points in this race, which was wild in itself. But yeah, I think all in all, this race is dramatic for the wrong reasons. Next up is Coda. And Coda is tricky for me because it was a really, really good race, but there wasn't really one moment from this race that everyone will remember. And so for that reason, I have it in great race. Coda, you had George taking out Carlos on the first lap, which is so sad for poor Carlos, who got his second legitimate pole of the year. Coda was another one where it was primarily a Red Bull Mercedes battle. There were moments where Max was pretty far ahead, but once again, Mercedes had to take a different strategy, and it seemed to pay off well for them. There were a few controversies around this one with the FIA not calling the meatball flag on Checo, who had damage on one of his front wings, which ended up flying off. Valtteri spinning off into the gravel and bringing out a safety car. And on that safety car restart, you had Stroll making a late move, causing Alonso to go into a wheelie, crash his car, and then still manage to finish 7th. Max had like a super long pit stop, so that put Hamilton into the lead for a while, and you had the last few laps of Max trying to catch up to Hamilton. I think he repassed him with like 6 laps to go. And then Seb, at one moment, was leading the race, and then had to pit and had a super long pit stop, and it was so disappointing. But then he made some absolutely incredible passes around that last corner, going around the outside on a high-speed corner, which were just fantastic to watch and just really made you feel sad that he was retiring, because he still has so much in him. And next up is Mexico. Mexico was a lot of people's least favorite race of the year. For me, it was the second worst, only because of Daniel making his charge through the field. And that was literally the only thing that happened in this race. I think teams didn't fully understand the tire degradation in this one. And so you had Mercedes going from medium tires to hard tires, expecting that the Red Bulls mediums that they decided to go on were eventually going to tail off but they never did. And so it was just an entire race of just waiting for the tires to degrade and it never happening. Yeah, because I think Seb went super long on softs to start, and so that clued Daniel into the fact that he could go long on the mediums and go on the long on the softs at the end. And then Max was able to see from Daniel that the mediums would last forever, and so he just like stayed on his mediums till the end of the race. But yeah, the Daniel's passing was the only thing that happened in this race, and so just don't bother with it if you're not a Daniel fan. And the second to last race of the year is Interlagos. And Interlagos is obviously a straight banger. I've gone back and forth with this, but I think for me, it's the second best race of the year. You had George starting on pole because of his win in the sprint race and him driving away. You had Daniel taking out K-Mag, who then took out Daniel on the first lap, bringing out a safety car. And on the safety car restart, you had Lewis and Max colliding in turn 2. You had Charles and Lando colliding. And then Charles and Max both had to go for wing replacements, and they battled their way through the field. The Alpines having a ton of team orders because of what happened in the sprint race. And Esteban being told, "You will let Alonso pass. Do you understand?" And then you had Lando, his car dying near the end, bringing out another late safety car. There is a theme this year. Late safety car usually means a great ending. But unfortunately, it meant that Checo got eaten up on his medium tires and Seb got eaten up on his medium tires. The reason why I have this below Silverstone, though, is while it was a great race all the way through, there was never really a solid battle for first. George led pretty well the whole way through, and even after the safety car, like Lewis was trying to catch him and just never could. And so that was exciting, but you never had that moment like in Silverstone where it just looked like any one of those 5 cars could have won. So that is why for me it is second. And I think just, yeah, the racing in Silverstone just was so special. And so I think if I'm looking back on this season, that's what I'm going to remember the most, as good of a race as Interlagos was. Oh, and then of course you had the spiciest radio messages between Max and Checo, which just sets up so much drama for 2023. I am so excited. Because you have Max refusing to let Checo back through, and Checo being like, "That's just the person he is," and like a lot of people losing respect for Max, which I've been saying from the beginning. I'm just saying, like, this is like very toxic culture at Red Bull, and so I think Max fans are finally kind of seeing that side of him, that it's always the nicest. And so I'm starting to see the change of Max from the underdog to the Sebastian Vettel villain, where he's dominant and a bit of a dick about it. Yeah, this race just had absolutely anything you could want from a race, and so that's why it is a straight banger. Finally, we have the perennial anticlimactic Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi, for me, is going in some good moments. Just ahead of Imola and Australia was another one where Max kind of ran away with it. But all of the intrigue of this one came from the battle between Checo and Charles for who was going to get P2 in the drivers, because they were tied on points going into this race. So you had Checo going for the 2-stop and you had Charles going for the 1-stop. And I think Checo was maybe 1 or 2 laps too short in making it work. Yeah, other than that, there were a few good little battles here and there, but it was definitely much more of a strategy race than an overtaking race. Yeah, so that was a little bit disappointing. But then I have it in some good moments because it was Seb's last race in F1, and so a lot of the focus was on him, and he was a little bit screwed by Aston Martin making a poor strategy decision, but he had a few good overtakes and had a little bit of a battle trying to catch Daniel, and then of course doing donuts at the end and just his interview after. And so those were all great moments from it. It wasn't necessarily the racing, but definitely some things that I will remember from that race, as well as Daniel managing to get points in his last race for McLaren and possibly his last race in F1. So that was my tier list for the 2022 F1 races. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. I'm sure some of you have a few of them rated differently. Silverstone and Brazil were the only two bangers this year, I think, which is disappointing considering I think we had like at least 6 bangers in 2021. See you later when I rank my drivers as well as the quali sessions for this year. Bye.